Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I'm very happy indeed to have back Adnan Rashid. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you so much for having me again, Paul. My pleasure.
Well, for those who might not know, Adnan is quite a famous historian now and lecturer. And you can see much of his work on his YouTube channel. Just Google Adnan Rashid. And also, I recommend you follow him on Twitter. His Twitter handle is Mr. MR Adnan Rashid. Today, Adnan has very kindly agreed to come back and talk about the history of Islam and Britain. This is a hugely interesting subject, and the history of Islam and Britain goes back to the early days of the medieval period. But I'll let Adnan talk us through that. So, sir, when you're ready, please do introduce us to this fascinating subject.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for once again giving me the opportunity to address your audiences. And you're doing an amazing job in discussing all these academic topics. One of them is Islam and Britain, not necessarily Islam in Britain. I like to title this topic as Islam and Britain, and you will see why that is the case. Islam has been a very active participant in the British, or in the making of the British civilization in general, and the English identity in particular. Islam was there in England before there was England. And this may shock many people out there. How is that possible? I mean, England basically is a country that came to be known England or Angle land due to the Angles. Angles had migrated to the British Isles after the Roman Empire collapsed, and when the Romans left Britain in the 4th and the 5th century, eventually. So what happened was many tribes from current day Germany and Scandinavia came into Britain, and these tribes were called Saxons, Jutes, and Angles. Later on, in southern Britain, many different principalities arose as a result of these migrations, and kings and chiefs were appointed for different people. And collectively, these people were called Angles, right? Those who came from Scandinavia, right? So Angles basically established few governments, few principalities in southern Britain that came to be known. For example, Mercia was one, then Wessex was another one, Essex was another principality, and some of them, these names ring a bell even today. You know, these names are still there. Essex and Wessex is still there as territory, right? So these territories were governed by Anglo-Saxons. I mean, the collection or the collective endeavor of establishing governments in southern Britain was called the Anglo-Saxon government, right? And these people were called thenceforth Anglo-Saxons because they mixed with each other. The Saxons and the Angles, they mixed with each other and they became Anglo-Saxons. And then came a country called Angle land later on in much of southeastern Britain, right? The west was mainly Wales or Celts, and in the extreme north of the island, we had Picts, later on called Scots. Right.
Can I just, I don't mean to pause you, but I just want to clarify one thing, Adnan. You mentioned the Celts and the Picts. Were these the indigenous people who were then pushed westwards by these incomers over time? So we're talking here about the original inhabitants of these isles in England. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes, that's correct.
Right.
When Angles and Saxons and Jutes came in from the east, or from the eastern part of Europe, east to Britain, basically, east of Britain. When they came into Britain, they drove the natives westwards. And this is how you get the Celts, who later on became the Welsh and the Irish. Okay. Right. And in the north, we had the Picts. Picts were obviously there even before the Angles and Saxons and Jutes appeared in Britain, because Picts were already fighting the Romans, hence the Hadrian Wall, right? Yeah. The famous Hadrian Wall, which was drawn all the way across Britain in the north. Okay, I mean, it passes through Newcastle, the city of Newcastle. If anyone has been there, it is very close to the city of Newcastle. So yes, you're right, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But in the south, we had obviously Islam was born as we know it today in the Arabian Peninsula. The Prophet of Islam was born in 571 CE, and this is the time when Anglo-Saxons were still migrating into Britain, and then Islam emerged as a power after the death of the Prophet, and it took another century for the Muslims to reach as far as Spain, which is very close to Britain, relatively. And this is when we find the first mention of Muslims in Britain. There was an English historian, an Anglo-Saxon historian rather. His name was Bede the Venerable. This is how he's known today, and he was a priest in current day city of St. Albans, right? And it's a very old city. In fact, it is thought that Christianity arrived in Britain for the first time in St. Albans. This is where this person who is buried in St. Albans was the man who introduced Christianity during the Roman period, and he was martyred, and there is a showing there in his name. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Anglo-Saxons basically were the first, you can say, people who established powerful governments, effective enough to rule, have laws, have currency, have clergy working with them or for them within Britain. So this was the rise of civilization, so to say, in Britain with the Anglo-Saxons. And from the very start, Anglo-Saxons had heard about Islam and were influenced by Muslims in a number of different ways. And how Islam made its way into Britain is absolutely fascinating. You know, the details are just mind-blowing. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Bede the Venerable, the historian, the Anglo-Saxon historian, he mentions for the first time the presence of the Muslims in France. And he was referring to the Battle of Poitiers. Battle of Poitiers, or the Battle of Tours, also known as Battle of Tours. This took place in 732, when Charles Martel, the father of the famous Charlemagne, defeated an incursion of the Arabs and the Berbers, a mixture of an Arab army and the Berbers. They invaded current day France, and they went as far as Tours, which is very close to Britain, by the way, not very far from London. I would say less than 500 miles from London across the channel, right? And Bede, writing in England at the time, he mentions that the Saracens have arrived in France, or in northern territory of France, for that matter. And he uses the word Saracens. Okay, Saracens was the word used for the Arabs from a very early period. Christian church fathers, when they were referring to the Arabs, they always use the word Saracen. Saracen means people of the tents, or desert dwellers, basically, right? So it was a very convenient term used by later authors and historians to describe anyone coming from Arabia. So this is why even during the Crusades, the term Saracen was used loosely to refer to the Turks and the Muslims from the Middle East and the Arabs. So that's the first mention of Muslims in Britain, when Bede noticed the presence of the Muslims in northern France. Then we have many powerful Anglo-Saxon kings that followed. They lived after Bede had written, and one of them was King Offa. Offa is a very famous figure in early English history. He ruled from 756 to 796, almost 40 years. He ruled for 40 years, and he was a very powerful king. In fact, he was the most powerful Anglo-Saxon king to date. And he was ruling central England. And so he ruled much of Midlands, parts of southern Britain, not Wessex, not Essex, but just beyond Wessex and Essex. That was Offa's territory. And he's even known for an achievement called Offa's Dyke. Basically, he had dug a huge ditch to keep the Celts out from his territory, because he was facing hostility from Celts as well as the northern Picts.
And you can still see this today, by the way. You can actually walk along it now. It's still a landmark on the landscape that you can actually walk along. It's called Offa's Dyke still, obviously.
That's right. Absolutely. It's basically Offa's Dyke divides England from Wales, pretty much. Roughly speaking, it's not exact, but but it is very much visible to this day, absolutely. So Offa was a very powerful king, very influential. He minted his own coins. His coins are absolutely fascinating, very beautiful coins. For some reason, he minted Islamic coins.
Wow.
One of the
Hang on, you're saying a king of England minted Islamic coins. Come on, Adnan, that can't be true. Surely that can't be true.
This is actually true, and those people who are watching right now, they can Google Offa's dinar, OFFA, and they put the word dinar, DINAR. You will see the dinar minted by Offa. There is one example in the British Museum. Fortunately, it survived, and it is there. So Offa did mint dinars based upon the Abbasid model, and it is a direct copy of Caliph al-Mansur's dinars. Okay, Caliph al-Mansur, he ruled from 750s onwards, and he was a contemporary of Offa. He was ruling at the same time when Offa had come to power in current-day England. Although there was no England at the time, he was ruling Mercia, a principality within England called Mercia. So Offa was minting Islamic dinars even before there was England. Right. So this is what I mean when I say Islamic identity, or things Islamic for that matter, or Islamic objects were found or handled or even discovered in Britain before there was England. England became
an Anglo-Saxon king in England was minting coinage with the in Arabic with the Shahada on. Well, what is the Shahada? Well, what's that say in English?
Well, it is a direct copy of Caliph al-Mansur's dinars, and the copy made by Offa was dated 157 Hijri. 157 Hijri to be precise, right? And the dinar has the formula Muhammad Rasulullah inscribed on it very, very clearly.
Wow.
Okay, it is fascinating to see that and know that. I did a lecture in Norwich for an English audience, and I put the coin up on the wall, in my presentation, and I asked people to read what is written on it, so they could read Offa Rex clearly written in Latin. You can read Offa Rex written, but they couldn't make out other words. And when I explained what that was, their jaws dropped. Literally, they couldn't believe it, that this is how far back Islam goes when it comes to the history of Britain, right? So I explained that it states in the Arabic language, Muhammad Rasulullah, Muhammad the messenger of God. And when you turn it upside down, you see Offa Rex inscribed in Latin. So in other words, Offa had personally sanctioned the minting of these coins. And there are theories as to why he did that. Of course, he was not a Muslim. A lot of people claim that because he minted this coin, he must have been a Muslim, right? And there are other reasons they try to give, but these theories are absolutely, without any substance in history. Offa was a Christian king. He had coins minted with crosses on them. He paid homage to the Pope, right? And in fact, these coins that were later on called mancus. Okay, the name of the currency, the denomination was mancus, right? And a lot of scholars assume, or they assert, that the word mancus actually originates from the Arabic word manqush, which means to inscribe, right? So because these coins were inscribed, that's why they were called mancuses, right? So Offa minted these coins to pay tax to the Pope. So these were offerings made for the Pope or towards the church. And obviously there must be demand from the Pope or from the papacy to mint these coins in particular, because the Abbasid gold was readily accepted throughout the Mediterranean region. Abbasids had dominated trade in the Middle East, as far as Central Asia and North Africa and parts of Europe, Southern Europe, let's say, right? So all of this territory was heavily influenced by the Abbasid currency. You can say the Abbasid dinar was the dollar of the day. And that's why English and French kings were imitating these dinars, using their own gold, but inscribing their gold or their coins with Arabic calligraphy for them to be accepted in the international market. So these forgeries, let's call them. I mean, if you want to be crude, although they were minted officially by the governments, but they were actually imitations. They were imitations of dinars, and the purpose was for them to be accepted, because European gold was not accepted, or not accepted as much as the Abbasid gold was acceptable for traders in the Mediterranean region. That's why people started to imitate the Abbasid dinars to bolster their trade prospects. So this is one example. The coin was found in Italy in the 19th century, and then it was clear that it was minted in Britain, in Mercia, by one of the die makers or money makers of Offa, because the name of Offa is very clearly inscribed. And fortunately, I happen to have one of them, but without Offa Rex inscribed on it.
Wow.
It is an imitation. It is a mancus, but it doesn't have Offa Rex inscribed on it. If that was the case, I would be a rich man, you know.
But you're saying the coin in question, the King Offa coin, is in the British Museum, so it is actually viewable by the public, I assume.
Correct. It is in the money room. If you walk into the British Museum from the main entrance, and then you take a left, go up the stairs, and you will find a room on your right, and that's the money room. And sometimes they take it off for whatever reasons, but it is generally found in a case there. It's a very special item for the British Museum. A lot of people actually go and see it, and very few people know about it, unfortunately, but more people need to know about it, that Islam had a physical presence in some form in Britain even before there was England, right? And this is one of the first examples of physical evidence of things Islamic in the British Isles. And then later on, of course, Vikings invaded territories, East Anglia, Northumbria, and all the way down to East Anglia and much of Eastern England, let's say. And Vikings were raiding for nearly 200 years, if not more. And when Vikings were coming in from Scandinavian principalities, they were bringing a lot of money with them, because they came here to settle down. They raided a lot of English towns. They wreaked devastation initially. Even the town of Lindisfarne, which was a monastic town, there were monasteries there. There were priests, and one of the Gospels actually that survived is called Lindisfarne Gospel. You can see it in the British Library. It's a beautiful piece of work. Yeah, it is. It's a beautiful piece of art. I don't know if you've seen it, Paul. Have you seen it?
No, I absolutely. I have. I've seen it on a number of occasions. It's just literally about 20 feet from an 8th century Quran and also the Codex Sinaiticus. Is all in one. These treasures are all in one room in the British Library in Euston. So I do recommend people visit.
Absolutely. I think John Ritbolt gallery in the British Library, this is where you find all these fascinating manuscripts, and it really, really amazes you how this particular copy of the Gospels has survived for the last 1,300 years. It's absolutely fascinating. So this is the time when Vikings were invading, and some of these artifacts have survived. Vikings brought a lot of silver in particular with them. They were more interested in silver for some reason, and even to this day, metal detectorists find hoards upon hoards buried in East Anglia or East Britain, Eastern Britain, let's say, right? Hoards upon hoards of Abbasid coins minted in Baghdad in some cases, in other cases, possibly other mints, Central Asian mints. And these Vikings were trading with the Arabs or people living within the Abbasid territory, and they were selling slaves and fur from Europe. And in return, they were getting gold and silver, and they were more interested in silver. So they brought all this silver. There were no banks at the time. There were no chambers and vaults. So what the Vikings did, they would dig a ditch and put the money or put the silver acquired through raiding or trading into these ditches, and then obviously put a sign on top of it. And then in some cases, they never returned. They probably died in wars or never had the chance to return. And these hoards are found to this day in Britain. I mean, you can even type Viking silver hoards in England or in Britain, and you will see the map where they were found. And also in Scandinavian states like Denmark, Norway, Sweden, similar hoards were found buried in those territories also. The Vikings brought a lot of Islamic money, Islamic coins to Britain. Now, it doesn't stop there. Influences of Islam and Muslims continued for a very long time within Britain. Usually, historians call this period the Dark Age, as far as the European history is concerned, which is now pretty much an idea which is not accepted by scholars anymore, because there was a lot happening in Europe at the time as well. So the Dark Ages idea is now basically outdated history, right? But the reason why it was called the Dark Age in the first place was because there was not much written about this age. There are long gaps of information. I mean, we have a lot of gaps in knowledge. We don't know much about this period, what the kings were doing, what the people were going through, and what was happening in these regions and territories at the time. But a lot was happening in Islamic Spain at the time. You see, Al-Andalus was a very powerful influence for the rest of Europe. Muslims came into the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, and then a strong, powerful Muslim government was established under the Umayyads. Primarily established by an Umayyad fugitive prince. His name was Abdurrahman I. He established an Umayyad principality, which later on became a caliphate. Abdurrahman III in the 10th century, he claimed to be a rival caliph to the ones in Baghdad. So it became a very powerful Muslim principality, ruling much of Spain. And in this period, a lot of scholars had traveled to Spain, and they took a lot of knowledge from Muslims. So let's say from the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th century, there was a lot of influx of British men in particular, because we're dealing with Britain today, we're dealing with England in particular. Let's talk about British scholars who had traveled throughout these ages. Apart from what I have mentioned earlier, Muslim identity in Britain from the very start of the Anglo-Saxons, there was a lot happening later on. One book in particular, before we move forward, I would like to recommend is this very powerful and a very important book.
Wow, that's a lot. Anglo-Saxon Perceptions of the Islamic World by Catherine Scarf Beckett. Wonderful English name. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a fascinating book that discusses a lot more than I have touched upon. I cannot possibly cover the entire content addressed in this book. That's not possible for this short sitting, and the purpose of this sitting is to introduce our audiences to this topic so that they can go and do their own research. So there's a lot covered in this book with regards to Anglo-Saxon pilgrims traveling to the Middle East to go and visit the Holy Land, Jerusalem in particular. So there were many Anglo-Saxon authors or writers who had written about the journey, their experiences in Jerusalem at the time, and Catherine talks about those travelers and their experiences in the Middle East with the Muslims and their perceptions of Islam. And she also talks about Offa and Offa's coin and all that. It is all addressed in this particular book, published by the Cambridge University Press. It's a very good text to read. So definitely consult this work, my brothers and sisters. Those of you who are listening.
Get that, I'm definitely going to have to buy that.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating work, Paul. Absolutely amazing, mind-blowing. A lot of you may know a lot of things, but there are so many historic ideas and facts that simply are not put out in public, and there's a lot there. So moving on to the 9th and the 10th and the 11th century, this was a very vibrant period when it comes to cross-pollination of ideas between civilizations, what we call the British civilization or the Anglo-Saxon civilization before the Normans took Britain, because Anglo-Saxons ruled much of Britain for nearly 300 years, let's say from 700 to 1000, right? And it was in 1066 when Normans invaded England, and the last English king, Harold, or the last Anglo-Saxon king for that matter, Harold, was defeated. And this happened after the famous Edward the Confessor died, who is buried in Westminster Abbey. He's the first English king to be buried there, amazingly. And I'm really, a huge fan of all this history. It really fascinates me. One place in particular I would like everyone to visit if you live in Britain and in London, to visit Westminster Abbey. I would say 60 to 70% of British history is there. Some of the most important figures in the history of this country are buried there for the last, you will find the history of the last 1,000 years in this one little space, Westminster Abbey in London. Edward the Confessor is buried there, and thenceforth most major monarchs, personalities, intellectuals, poets, even Geoffrey Chaucer is buried there.
I remember standing in front of Geoffrey Chaucer's tomb thinking, wow, this is amazing. And Henry V, Elizabeth I, and they've got this portrait of her in marble or stone. And you actually recognize it from her portrait. She's very clearly it's accurate to life, very distinct tones and so on. And the architecture and the whole ambience, it was a monastic, it was an abbey where monks used to pray, of course, originally. So it has huge historic, and it's where our current queen was crowned as well when she became queen in 1953 as well.
Absolutely, and what really fascinates me, one particular personality really fascinates me, and that's Edward I, Edward the Longshank, also known as Edward the Longshank, the king who went on a crusade in the 13th century. In 1270s, he was on the crusade and he came back, and he was a very powerful king. He built many of the Welsh castles we see to this day. Conway, Carnarvon, Beaumaris, Harlech, all these castles were built by Edward I. And the fact that he had been to the Middle East and he communicated with the Mongols, almost allied with the Mongols against the Mamelukes who were fighting the Crusaders at the time. Sultan Baybars was alive at the time. So this character in particular fascinates me. His tomb is there. His tomb is there in Westminster Abbey, and it is clearly stated on the tomb, Hammer of the Scots, the Hammer of the Scots, right? It was inscribed later on. It wasn't his doing. It wasn't his. It was a later perception projected onto the tomb by later English thinkers and historians. And amazingly, his tomb was opened in the 18th century. Not many people know this. And his body was pretty much very intact. And he was basically dressed in this purple gown with a scepter in his hand and all that. It's amazing, absolutely fascinating personality. Coming back to, and now while these kings were ruling, while the Crusades were going on, you see, when people study the history of Britain and Islam, when they look at the interaction between the two civilizations, they always see, three aspects of Britain's history with Islam come out very prominently, right? What are these three aspects? Number one is basically the Crusades, right? Because there were many English kings, in particular two, actually not many, two, Richard the Lionheart first, and then Edward I, these two English kings, and many barons and nobles, of course, and knights went from England to fight a crusade in the Middle East. But two kings went from Britain. So many people focus on this history of conflict, right? Then we look at colonialism. Later on, colonization of Muslim lands by Britain. So people think about that. People always have that in mind. So they have a very negative perception, right? And then finally, we have, Muslim coming to Britain in the 50s, in the 60s, immigration, right? Migration of Muslims in the hundreds of thousands from Muslim lands like India, Pakistan, and other places, right? So this is what people look at. When they think of Islam and Britain, this is what comes to mind. But you see, what they are missing is far more fascinating and far more interesting than what we have seen so far, right? This is what we're going to talk about today, that positive cross-pollination of ideas, knowledge, and energy, right? So for almost 3 to 4 centuries, Englishmen, Britishmen, in some cases, Englishmen were traveling to Islamic lands and learning the Arabic language to bring back the knowledge pioneered by the Arabs in Spain in particular, and in the Middle East in general, back to England, back to Britain. And I can give examples in that regard. But before I give examples, not many people know this, that the first ever Latin translation of the Quran was made in the 12th century by a man called Robert of Ketton. Robert of Ketton knew the Arabic language, obviously, and he translated the Quran at the behest of Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a very famous French scholar in France.
He's canonized, yeah.
Exactly, canonized. And he basically asked Robert, an Englishman, to translate the Quran into Latin. And this translation was used for as late as the 16th century. As late as the 16th century, the same Latin translation was being published and printed in European printing houses, including Venice and Rome. There are copies available to this day. And one book in particular I strongly recommend is this very, very important text.
Reading the Quran in Latin Christendom, 1140 to 1516. Who is the author of that?
The author is Berman. Yeah, Thomas E. Berman. Thomas E. Berman, and this is a very, very interesting book, Reading the Quran in Latin Christendom. It talks about... Sorry?
Who's it published?
It's published by Princeton, I think, if I'm not mistaken. No, yeah, Pennsylvania, sorry. The University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
The University of Pennsylvania is an American university, it's an academic work, and it is fascinating with a lot of detail on how the Quran was translated by the Englishman called Robert of Ketton in Latin. Of course, the translation was not perfect. It was biased, naturally. Crusades were going on, and one of the reasons why Bernard of Clairvaux he did this was to understand the Saracens or the enemy more. But the point is, there were Englishmen who had learned the Arabic language. They have taken the pains of learning the Arabic language, which was not a straightforward language for someone coming from Britain to learn, right? And one of the reasons they learned this language was to pioneer Arabic sciences or Arabic knowledge. When I say Arabic sciences in inverted commas, this science, which was pioneered by the Arabs in Islamic Spain, in Al-Andalus, having taken it from Greeks and Romans and Indians, they brought this knowledge together. Primarily, first, it happened in Baghdad, and later on, a lot of this knowledge was transferred to Spain because Spanish caliphs, Spanish rulers such as Hakam II, were particularly interested in this knowledge being pioneered, research written, copied in Central Asia, in libraries and book markets of Central Asia, of Baghdad, of Damascus and Cairo and Kairouan and all these centers of Muslim learning. This was all in fashion. So Spanish caliphs and rulers were very, very interested in this, and they would basically send their agents to collect all this knowledge from all these libraries and bring it back to Spain. And it is stated, it is recorded in history that Hakam II, his library consisted of 400,000 volumes, manuscripts, handwritten books. He spent money, he basically, he threw money at his agents and book collectors and booksellers to acquire these manuscripts. And 40 volumes alone contained the catalog. 40 volumes alone contained the catalog of the books he possessed in his private personal library. Much of this was destroyed, unfortunately, later on during the Reconquista, and then when Catholic monarchs took Spain in 1492, and 1 million books allegedly were burnt by the Catholics later on. So much of this legacy, unfortunately, was destroyed by war. Only 10% may have survived today, to this day, in Spanish libraries. You can still find it there. So a lot of this knowledge, created a civilization of a grand scale. Okay, some scholars even called it the ornament of the world. There was a German nun who visited Spain in the 10th century. I think her name was Roswitha, and she stated that the city of Cordoba is an ornament, or rather the ornament of the world. It is the most beautiful, the most civilized, the most populated city in the world. And that was the case in the 10th century. So Englishmen, not very far from Spain, were also very interested, of course. So many came seeking this knowledge, learning the Arabic language in places like Toledo, Cordoba, Seville, Valencia. And some of them are remembered and even noticed by historians to this day. One book on that topic I would strongly recommend, where Englishmen in particular, not Europeans in general, students and scholars are flocking to Spain from all over Europe, in particular Germany, Italy, France, and Britain. So we're not discussing Italy and Germany and France. Today we're discussing Britain in particular, England, right? And one book which I strongly recommend is this, on that very topic, The Matter of Araby in Medieval England. The author is Dorothy Metzlitsky. Dorothy Metzlitsky has published this book. My copy is a bit
well read, yeah,
well read and well used. And this book was published by another American institution, if I remember correctly. Yale University Press. Okay, this was published by Yale University Press, and I think it's available in paperback as well. I hope you can find a copy. If it is very difficult to find, it's pretty expensive as well. So I would recommend strongly a second-hand copy from one of the book-selling websites, right? So this is a fascinating book that talks about much of the Muslim influences in Britain when it comes to knowledge. And if I read the contents of the book, what are the contents? The transmission, for example. Number one, heading one is the transmission, and she discusses the Crusades, Arabian culture in Sicily, Arabian culture in Spain. Then the second heading is Arabum Studia or Studia. Okay, Arabum Studia in England. Basically, in England, Arabic study in England in particular, early translators and the state of learning. Then Walker of Malvern and Petros Alfonsi. Then she talks about Adilard of Bath, a very prominent figure in this regard, an Arabist par excellence, a man who was actually a member of Henry I's court. Henry I, who was an English king, one of the Norman kings. Adilard of Bath in the early 12th century was very active in his court, and he was an Arabist. He had even pioneered the Divan system, which he had learned from Islamic Sicily. He brought the Divan system, or exchequer, what we know today as the exchequer. It was Adilard who brought that system from Sicily, from the Arabs in Sicily. So Adilard of Bath, the city of Bath, is a very important figure, very well read, very, very much appreciated by historians of Islamic influence in Britain. Then Robert of Ketton, I've already discussed him. I've already talked about him. He translated the Quran and other books from from Arabic to Latin. Then there was another very interesting character, Dorothy, she addresses in her book. His name is Daniel of Morley. Okay, Daniel of Morley is a fascinating character who was a huge fan of Arabic learning. And in fact, he paid a lavish tribute to the Arabs in one of his writings titled Philosophia, right? In his book, he basically, I don't think I can find the exact quote in the book, but he stated, if I remember correctly, that when I went to Paris from England, I found these monks, Catholic monks, teaching philosophy. And the more they pretended to be learned, the more...
I know where this is going, Adnan. I know where this is going. Carry on with it. Carry on.
This is Daniel of Morley writing.
Guess what he's saying.
So he said, the more they pretended to be learned, the more illiterate they sounded. Then I heard of the Arabs and their philosophy, which was being taught in Spain. So I made my way there and I learned from my masters, the Arabs. So he was a huge proponent of Arabic philosophy, Arabic sciences in Britain. So Daniel of Morley comes back and he meets a man called Bishop John of Norwich. And Bishop John encourages him to teach philosophy in Oxford. And then a school of philosophy was established in Oxford. And later on, these schools expanded. A lot more schools were established. And then later on, furthermore, subsequently, these schools collectively came to be known as the Oxford University, right? So the Oxford University was a direct, how can I put it? It was a direct brainchild of sciences and philosophy studied in Islamic Spain. The first science ever taught in the University of Oxford, or the schools of Oxford, was the science of astronomy that came directly from Islamic Spain. And this is clearly attested by R.T. Gunther in his book on the history of science in Oxford, right? It was published by the Oxford University, and he testifies to this, that the first science taught in Oxford was astronomy, and it came directly from Islamic Spain, works pioneered and written and translated in Al-Andalus in Spain. So Daniel Morley is an absolutely fascinating figure. Dorothy Metzlisky talks about him in this book, and the list of content goes on where she actually specifically mentions Englishmen, British men traveling to the Muslim lands, Islamic Spain in particular, and possibly beyond, like Sicily and the Middle East. In the case of Adil Arabat, Adil Arabat had gone to Syria, as far as Syria, Aleppo, according to some reports. So she talks about Roger of Hereford, Alfred the Englishman, and Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon, also a very famous, well-known English philosopher, medieval philosopher, was an Arabist. He knew the Arabic language. Michael Scott, also another translator who had translated many books in Spain for European literati, and these books were translated from Arabic to in Latin, because Latin was the literary language of the Europeans at the time, well read, well studied in England, Germany, France, and Italy, and Spain, of course, right? So there's a lot more she discusses in this book, and I cannot possibly go through all of it. A very, very important book by Dorothy Metzlisky. Must read for anyone interested in this topic, how medieval England was directly influenced by Muslim knowledge, Muslim contributions on science and philosophy, and generally Arabic works pioneered by Jewish and Christian scholars as well. A general book which discusses much of Europe, larger Europe, scholars from France and Germany and elsewhere would travel to Islamic Spain. This book is a very important work, The Hidden Debt to Islamic Civilization by S.E. Al-Jazairi. S.E. Al-Jazairi. It is a treasure trove of information. So the tone of the book may not be very academic, but the references, the information this book contains are absolutely mind-blowing. It's an encyclopedia of information on this very topic, how Islamic civilization influenced the larger European or Western civilization during the Middle Ages, right? This is a very important book for us to look at. Now, moving on from the Middle Ages, apart from the Crusades and apart from the Reconquista, there was a lot of cross-pollination going on between the Islamic world and the Western world in general, and in Britain in particular. And I've already highlighted some of these issues. So knowledge of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, alchemy. In fact, one of the English translators, I think it was Robert of Ketton, again, Robert of Ketton, he translated a work authored by Jabir bin Hayyan. Jabir bin Hayyan had written on alchemy, and when he translated the book, he writes in the preface of the book that I translate this book from Arabic to Latin so that my European brethren can learn from the Arabs, because I feel sorry for my people as to how backward they are in these sciences. So again, this was a very positive impact Islamic civilization had on European intellectual development, right? A lot of scholars were heavily influenced by the works of Ibn Rushd, for example. Ibn Rushd, who was also known as Averroes in Latin, his works were being studied, basically researched, and a lot of commentaries were written on Ibn Rushd in Europe during the Middle Ages. In fact, one of the greatest scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages in the West was Thomas Aquinas. You know, Thomas Aquinas.
You're absolutely right. He was hugely influenced by these Arabic philosophy, and he got into trouble for it by the University of Paris. He was a Dominican academic professor, absolutely extraordinary intellectual at the time. But towards the end of his life, his thought, which was kind of like a synthesis, was it not, between Catholicism, the Catholic thinking in a scholastic mode, and Arab philosophy, his synthesis actually became widely accepted as kind of the new orthodox approach to knowledge, metaphysics, theology, to such an extent that he became the preeminent Catholic theologian of all time, the angelic philosopher he was called. And even in the 20th century, there were popes saying, look, if you're going to be a priest, you've got to study Thomas Aquinas. But he got many of his ideas, some Arabic philosophy from Islamic Spain. So, but he didn't call them Muslims. He wrote a famous book called the Summa Contra Gentiles, the summary of knowledge against the Gentiles. But these Gentiles were Muslims. He wouldn't call them by name. Oh no! But he borrowed the ideas big time from Spain, Islamic Spain. So this is like through the back door is Arab philosophy, Islamic philosophy through the back door, hugely influencing the much Catholic philosophy.
Absolutely, and he was directly influenced by Ibn Rushd. He was even accused of being an Averroist. Averroist, basically, it was a school of philosophers in Europe at the time, in particular Paris. And Aquinas was accused of being an Averroist, who was a follower of Ibn Rushd or Averroes. So while the Crusades were going on the one hand, on the other hand, we had this flower which was being crushed and leaving fragrance in the hand, in the very hand that was crushing it, what we call the Muslim civilization of Spain. It was actually being crushed at the time. Reconquista was happening in Spain at the same time when Crusades were taking place in the Middle East, right? So this was a coordinated, not necessarily linked, but a coordinated campaign of Crusades in Spain and in the Middle East. While many Westerners who came with the Crusaders, they took back so much knowledge and appreciation of the Muslim civilization with them. And one example is, this is a side point, not necessarily connected to our discussion today, but it's an important point that those Crusaders, those Westerners who actually interacted with the Muslims for a while, their attitude towards the Muslims changed completely. They appreciated the Arabs or the Muslims in general more than those who came recently. This is clearly acknowledged by a man who was writing during the Crusades. His name is Osama ibn Munqidh. Osama ibn Munqidh was a gentleman, was a knight, was a poet, was a man of literature, and a close friend of Saladin. And he lived the entire length of the Crusades. He was born in 1095 when Pope Urban II delivered his speech in Clermont. And he died in 1187 when the city of Jerusalem was recaptured by Saladin and his forces. So this was a fascinating character, lived the entire length of the first three Crusades, you can say, right? The first and the second and third Crusade. And he fought many battles. And he talks about these Crusaders, these knights who come from the West, who are recent arrivals. They are very staunch, very harsh, very ignorant. But those who have become accustomed to Muslims are very soft, very different in their attitude. They are very lenient in many regards. So you see this interaction with the Muslims and the Arabs did change people.
I'm just thinking of that recent Hollywood film, is it called The Kingdom of God, that featured the Saladin character. I forget.
Kingdom of Heaven.
Kingdom of Heaven, okay. Kingdom of Heaven.
Ridley Scott.
Yes. Scott. A very moving film, an extraordinary portrayal of Saladin. But there's an Egyptian actor, I think, who is just almost absolutely incredible. But the reason I mentioned the film is that exactly what you're saying. You get clearly some of the Christians there had become acquainted with what's really going on with the Muslims. You could see how influenced they were and how mild they were and how appreciative of the wisdom of. You can see some of the Islamic themes there, even though it's not explicit in the film. And then you get these other guys, the kind of hard-nosed crusaders who just want to destroy Islam. So you get this kind of split in the Christian church almost, but very beautifully portrayed in that film, I thought.
I think nothing much has changed today, Paul. There are many Islamophobes in the Western world today, right? And when they interact with Muslims, when they actually meet some Muslims and spend time with them, they come to realize, hold on, we are hating these people for no reason. There are no reasons to hate them. I mean, recently there was an example of an Islamophobe in Netherlands who was very active in the Islamophobia industry. And lo and behold, when he reads up on Islam and possibly meets some Muslims, he changes his mind, right? And there are many, many examples that can be given historically. So Islamophobia is mainly, whether it's medieval or modern, it is mainly due to that distance and that fear which people have in their minds of the Muslim civilization, right? And this fear, of course, is not, it doesn't come from a vacuum. It is pumped, it is instilled, it is put in there by, in the medieval case, Catholic monks and clergy who are writing on Islam and Muslims. And today we have the journalists who are doing a similar job to what the clergy and the monks were doing in the Middle Ages, painting the Muslims as barbarians, as bloodthirsty people, as lustful, perverts, and all sorts of things were written by the Catholic monks about Islam and Muslims. And I mean, this topic alone, that topic in itself is a fascinating topic, how the Westerners saw Islam through ages. Okay, there are some books I would strongly recommend. One of them is by an amazing scholar called Daniel Norman. Daniel Norman has written a book titled Islam and the West, Making of an Image. Islam and the West, Making of an Image. And there's another scholar called J.V. Toland. J.V. Toland has also written amazing works on this very topic, how the Muslims are perceived in the West throughout the Middle Ages, right? And this and it talks about Britain as well, how British clergy, knights, travelers, pilgrims basically looked at the Arabs and the Muslims and how they perceived them and how their perceptions changed after interacting with these people. So moving on to some more ideas. We have talked about the Middle Ages and some of the influences. I want to talk about some work. There's another book I would strongly recommend before we start discussing the period he was dealing with. Gerald MacLean and Nabil Matar have collectively written this fascinating book. Very, very interesting book, published by Oxford University Press, Britain and the Islamic World. Britain and the Islamic World, a fascinating work detailing a lot of history on how Islam and Britain interacted with each other as civilizations. Gerald MacLean and Nabil Matar. And Nabil Matar has written many more books on this topic, mainly addressing the Tudor period when Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth I were ruling Britain. So the point I'm trying to make is that Islam had a consistent presence, throughout the history, the very early recorded history of Britain onwards, right? Islam as a civilization, as a civilizational influence, as an entity, or as a principle, or as a philosophy, Islam has had a consistent presence in the British social, historic, and educational landscape, right? So let me repeat that. Islam has had a consistent presence throughout the history of Britain, in British psyche, in British intellectual development, and a lot more, right? Islam was never absent. When the British thinkers and authors became self-conscious, when they realized that they have to form an identity of their own, and they started writing books on their identity, on their heroes, and on their own civilization, their self-reflection also contained glimpses of Islam. Okay, Islam was never absent. It was never absent from the British Isles and from the British history. So Islam is not an alien faith or an alien idea or an alien philosophy as far as the British people and the British civilization is concerned. Rather, Islam has an active role in the making of what we call today the British civilization, or Great Britain, if you want to call it the Great Britain. Islam was always there in the making of Great Britain, right? And this starts from the very early history to this day. Okay, so talking about the early modern period when the Tudors came to power, and there's a lot more, by the way, to discuss, which we have skipped because we simply don't have time to do so, and it's nearly an hour already done. Okay, we don't want to exhaust our audiences with details.
To be honest, knowing my audience, they're not exhausted in the slightest, Adnan, when you're talking. Do carry on.
It's very kind of them. They are a beautiful people, and I really appreciate the fact that they appreciate this information, and I wish I could give more and more and more, and we will be doing more, inshallah.
What you've given is a huge value here is book references, and the channel Blogging Theology is all about getting people to read good books, not just books but good books. And so your academic recommendations are invaluable, so people, as you say, can follow this up for themselves. They're not just relying on videos. They go and get the books and study in depth further. So that's a really helpful thing you've done there, Adnan.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. And I am always honored to serve. And I have a lot of love for the British civilization, the history, the landscape, and the making of Britain as a civilization is absolutely fascinating. I wish more people could know this history so that we would have less Islamophobia, less misconceptions, less lack of appreciation. You see, we need more appreciation, more knowledge, and when we are made aware of this history collectively, I think we appreciate each other more. That's why discussing this history is very important. So moving on to the Tudor period, early modern period, Henry VIII comes to power, in the early 16th century, and his father Henry VII died. And even at that time, we are told, or we see that the Muslims had a very active presence in Britain. How do I know that? We can show some physical evidence of that. Henry VIII had a very controversial reign. To put it politely, right? Yeah. He's known for killing his 6 wives, or maybe Henry VIII and 6 wives. He didn't kill all of them, but most of them were actually.
The last one outlived him, actually. But a number of them did get their heads chopped off. This is true.
And she outlived him because he himself died.
Well, exactly.
So he couldn't play.
Otherwise, she may have gone the same way. Yeah.
But he was a very interesting character. Initially, his initial reign, his initial how can I put it? His period when he was ruling, initially he was a very effective ruler. Later on, due to the fact that he couldn't have children, male heirs to the throne, he was very disturbed by that particular aspect of his life. This is why he wanted to divorce and remarry so that he can have children, right? But at that time, when he published his great Bible, right? Initially, he was against the translation of the Bible into the English language. It was done by John Wycliffe, and later on, it was done by William Tyndale, who was a contemporary of Henry VIII. And William Tyndale was an English scholar who had translated the New Testament and even dedicated the copy to the king, and the king didn't appreciate it very much. And Tyndale was burnt at stake, partly due to King Henry VIII's role in it. Right.
Yeah, his agents. Henry VIII sent agents to Antwerp, where Tyndale was in exile, and had him basically condemned to death, and he was burnt at the stake. And Henry VIII had a pivotal role in that.
Exactly. And later on, ironically, King Henry himself sanctions an English Bible, using much of Tyndale's efforts, by the way. So in the making of his own Bible in the English language, he used Tyndale's New Testament, and of course it wasn't copied word by word, but a lot of inspiration came from Tyndale's work. And even Tyndale's story is a very sad story. It's a very unfortunate episode in our history. But anyway,
sorry, Karen. No, I just want to say briefly, a slight digression, but Speaker's Corner, there's a guy who comes along, a guy in his 30s, an English white guy, and he's a Tyndale fanatic, and he's got William Tyndale's original translation of the Bible, and that's his entire Christianity is focused around this one man and his English Bible, and he says, this is the true Bible, this is the true translation, and he preaches to everyone, to Muslims. He's been doing it for years. And I've had conversations, it's a complete waste of time. But anyway, he's just like this single-minded Tyndale fanatic. And you can still meet him at Speaker's Corner today,
And we have, just like that, we have King James fanatics, right? Yes, who still refer to the King James Bible with all its flaws and all its imperfections.
Yeah.
Translating the Bible is an ongoing process which still continues to this day.
Exactly.
So Tyndale's Bible was used by King Henry VIII, and the point I'm trying to make is that when King Henry VIII broke away from the church for whatever reasons that can be discussed in another sitting, when he broke away from the Catholic Church, he sanctioned his own Bible. It was called the Great Bible in the English language, and the title page was basically a propaganda exercise.
Yeah.
What do I mean by that? On the title page, you see the king sitting on the throne, and around the king, you have a lot of his courtiers. Oh, there you go. You have it.
But this is John Barton's book, A History of the Bible. But on the cover of this book, which you can't really see, is the Bible we're talking about. But what you said just reminded me of...
I don't know if it's the same title page, but on the right-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner, you see a man with a turban.
Oh, gosh.
There's a man standing with a turban.
Okay, no, this is a smaller extract.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay. Maybe people can Google the Great Bible title page, King Henry VIII, Great Bible title page. When you go down, basically the title page is like a propaganda exercise where King is sitting and there are those banners flying around with Vivat Rex written on it, which means long live the king or something like that. I think Vivat Rex means
long live the king.
Long live the king, right? So the king is the head of the church. He's sitting on the throne, and there are subjects around him. And by their statuses, they are given the position on the page. And on the bottom, you see the masses. You see people from different walks of life, and you see one man on the right-hand corner, the bottom right-hand corner, with a turban.
Yeah.
And scholars, they basically assert that this is a Muslim man who was basically who was shown to be a British citizen during the reign of King Henry VIII in the 16th century, right? When people cannot imagine Muslims walking around the streets of London, right? It's like, hold on a second. How can you find Muslims in the 16th century in London, in Britain, right? But the title page of the Great Bible of King Henry VIII shows a Muslim man in turban on the bottom right-hand corner of the title page. Okay, maybe someone can highlight that in the comment section later on, inshallah. I don't know if pictures, we can put up pictures or not, but I could have had possibly a picture, but I don't have it at the moment with me. So the point I'm making is that the Muslims were walking around in the streets of London, and many of them came from North Africa, no doubt, from Morocco. Predominantly Moroccan merchants, traders, and diplomats were walking around. And Nabil Matar has written a book on one of those ambassadors who was frequenting the court of Queen Elizabeth I, the very daughter of King Henry VIII, and his powerful successor, one of the most powerful Tudor monarchs, actually more so than her father and grandfather.
Just on that very point, earlier on this afternoon, I put a picture of this very guy who's the ambassador to this book on the community tab. So if you look on it now, you'll actually see a fantastic portrait of him on that with a description. So people may also...
Very elegant, very elegantly dressed. His turban is well done. His robes are absolutely graceful. He has a sword. His name is Abdul Wahid. Abdul Wahid, who was a Moroccan ambassador in Britain at the time, and he basically represented the Moroccan court in Britain. And Queen Elizabeth I, due to her enmity towards Spain, because Spain was the greatest Catholic power in Europe at the time.
The Spanish Armada famously tried to get her out, because she was seen as a heretic, because she was a bad Protestant, you see. So
exactly. 1588, the famous invasion of Britain on the part of the Spanish, and lo and behold, the Spanish Armada, 1588, a woman queen, a lady, defeats the powerful Catholic army of Spain.
Well, it was more to do with the weather, I think. The English weather. But anyway, well, if you want to spin it that way, Adnan, you can spin it that way. But
I am simply speaking the language of the court historians of Queen Elizabeth I, right? It was the Queen who defeated, and she was a very powerful. I mean, people call Margaret Thatcher the Iron Lady. In my opinion, the Iron Lady of Britain is Queen Elizabeth I. If you read her history, she was a very powerful character, a very, very, very successful monarch, especially when you consider the challenges she faced. She had the entire Catholic Church against her, right? That's why she reached out to the Muslims. Right. She wanted the Muslims to be allied to her, and that's why there's a book titled "The Queen and the Sultan." There's a very powerful book, very important book. I have it in my library, but I don't have it right next to me. I could have put it up. So do Google "The Queen and the Sultan," where Queen Elizabeth the First was in alliance with the Ottomans, or at least in spirit. She wanted to ally with the Ottomans against the Catholic coalition. And a famous battle had taken place between the Ottomans and the Catholic coalition, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a very, very important battle, very important victory for the Europeans against the Ottomans, even though Ottomans were able to recover soon after.
Still celebrated that very battle. The date of that battle is still celebrated every year by Catholics. They credit the victory to the Virgin Mary, actually, and so that day is still a significant one in European Christian history, and it's still remembered these days as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and a very important battle. And this is the time when Queen Elizabeth I is ruling Britain. Yeah. And she wanted an alliance with the Ottomans for her own survival, of course, because the entire European, how can I put it, political establishment was against her, because much of Europe at the time, minus Germany and some Scandinavian countries, much of Europe, the most powerful European militaries and governments were against her. So she was alone in that regard. So a fascinating history. Another thing I want to very quickly mention, the Ottomans were a huge source of inspiration for the British scholars, historians, and literati in particular, as already clarified, and the reasons have already been stated, because of political reasons, because the British government or the British people in general were facing an onslaught from mainland Europe due to the Catholic enmity, or the papacy was against Queen Elizabeth I. She was seen as a heretic, and she was a Protestant. She was an Anglican, heretic. So for that reason, the Pope and his supporters, like King of France and King of Spain, were not very happy with the Queen Elizabeth I. No. For that reason, the English intellectuals were more inclined to study the Ottomans, and a book was published while Queen Elizabeth I was possibly alive. The book was definitely researched. It was definitely researched when she was alive, because Richard Knowles, the author who authored this book, published it in 1603 when Queen Elizabeth I died. The very year she died, this was the year when Richard Knowles' book, History of the Turks, the famous History of the Turks, was published. So I have a copy of that in my library. I even made a video on my YouTube channel on that very book, but the video unfortunately is in Urdu, and I will be making one very soon in the English language on that very book. 1603, the first edition of this book, and 5 more editions were published subsequently of the same book, because the book became so popular. It was such a powerful history of the Ottoman Turks. It ran into over 1,000 pages. I think the first edition was nearly 1,000 pages, and then subsequent editions with subsequent editions, subsequent editions with subsequent editions. I mean, I hope people get my point here, right? They only expanded in their magnitude. So the first edition was 1603. The second edition was published in 1610. The third edition was published in 1621. The fourth edition was published in 1631. And then the fifth and the final edition of that particular work was published in 1638. And later on, of course, it was published later on with more editions by other scholars. So Richard Knowles had produced this magnus opum, or on the history of the Turks, and it's a fascinating history. Very much, how can I put it? Recommended. You can actually find the entire book on Google Books free of charge. You can actually title Richard Knowles. Knowles is spelled Knolles. Knowles, right? If you type Richard Knowles in Google and the title of the book, The History of the Turks, you will find one of the editions completely scanned free of charge on Google Books, and you can start reading it. It is Shakespeare's English, by the way, so it's not easily readable for everyone. And amazingly, Shakespeare himself had taken inspiration from this very work. Even his Merchant of Venice and other works, he had taken some of the inspiration, and even phrases.
Othello apparently is inspired.
Yes, Othello as well. Yes, Othello, absolutely. And even later on, Samuel Johnson, the man who authored or collected English dictionary in the 18th century, was very much fascinated by this work of art, if you want to call it that. It has many plates, woodcuts of Ottoman emperors in it. So this shows you the fascination the British people have had with Islam and things Islamic, or dynasties Islamic for that matter, for so long. And this was an accumulation of that, okay? Because of the British interest during the Tudor period in the Ottomans, they published works on that. Another thing I wanted to very quickly mention, Paul, before we go forward and finish the live today or for tonight, and not many people know this, that when King John, the brother of Richard the Lionheart, when the Crusades were happening, King John, I mean, we're going back now to the Middle Ages very quickly because I forgot to mention this earlier. King John, when he was facing problems from his barons, and when the Pope had basically issued decrees against him, so King John was feeling very cornered politically, militarily. He was very much cornered, right? So there are reports that he had sent an emissary to the Moroccan king at the time, asking him to send an army to help him, and if the army lands in England, in Britain, and is successful in defeating his barons, then he will convert to Islam, and so will his country. Yeah, wow. This is well acknowledged. Really? A lot of people dispute this, by the way. A lot of historians dispute this, but it is recorded in one of the medieval histories, authored by Roger of Wendover. Or it's also part of Matthew Paris's Chronicle. Matthew Paris was an English historian. His chronicle is mentioned there that King John sent an emissary to the King of Morocco asking him for help, and this was in the 13th century, early 13th century, when Magna Carta was put together. Okay.
Magna Carta, by the way, you can see in the British Library, along with the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Codex Sinaiticus, and a whole bunch of other things in the British Library in London as well.
Absolutely. So now, Paul, moving on very quickly. After all this, what do we have? We have the Enlightenment. If we come to the Enlightenment period, many British historians, authors, intellectuals were very much fascinated by Islam and Islamic civilization, starting with people like, let's say, John Locke. John Locke himself was heavily influenced. I mean, as you can see now, we are taking huge leaps from centuries to centuries, from periods to periods, because we want to cover as much as we can in this short sitting, right?
Yes.
So John Locke was a 17th century philosopher in Britain who had written extensively on democratic principles that are in use to this day, right? He had written 3 treatises on tolerance, and he was heavily influenced. In fact, some scholars even assert that his political theory came directly from his teacher, Edward Pocock, who is known to be the first Orientalist in British history. Edward Pocock taught Islamic studies in the University of Oxford, and John Locke would frequently attend his lectures. In fact, John Locke wrote in his writings that there is no man who inspired more, whose lectures rather attracted John Locke more than Edward Pocock's lectures in the University of Oxford, of course, teaching Islamic studies. So John Locke had attended these lectures, and some people even assert, some scholars, that much of his political philosophy, his views on kingship and monarchical systems come from Islamic system of caliphate. He deems the government to be a trust in the hand of the rulers, right? Just like a caliphate is, right? A caliph is a successor of God on earth. Just like that, a ruler is or ought to be a successor of God on earth. Something like that, similar to that. John Locke was very much fascinated. Then we have English scholars like Simon Oakley, who had written books on the history of Islam and Muslims. In particular, one of his books titled The History of the Saracens, early 18th century, published in 1708. And this was the work later on used by Edward Gibbon, the famous author of The Decline and the Fall of the Roman Empire. Very powerful work, a classic.
Massive classic work of historiography from the Enlightenment. It's still highly regarded by historians today. Very readable. The English is, I found it very readable. It's an amazing history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Highly recommend it.
One of the best, indeed, one of the best, even though it was written in the 18th century, but Gibbon was an absolute genius. He was an absolute genius. It took him 12 years to write this, and much of it was written in France. For some reason, many great inspirations come.
Like he had a house here. He just went on holiday. Yeah. Okay.
So it was published between 1776 to 1788. It took him 12 years to complete the work. It is an absolute elephant, when I say, in literature, right? It's an amazing,
really great to read. It's really enjoyable to read. It's not at all.
Yeah. And he pays lavish tributes to the Muslim civilization in his work. Chapter 50, if I'm not mistaken, deals with the rise of Islam, and thenceforth talks about Islamic history up to the Turks, the conquest of Constantinople in 1553. Then we have people like founding fathers of British civilization in the Enlightenment sense, basically, because the Enlightenment century is basically thought to be the century between 1700 to 1800, right? This is called the Enlightenment period, and many English scholars were directly inspired. One of them was Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the famous author of The Wealth of Nations, a very powerful book on economics, which is taught to this day. Much of it is taught to this day. Very powerful author, and actually one of the influences on Thomas Paine and Thomas Malthus as well, if I'm not mistaken, right? So Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in his essays on astronomy, paid a lavish tribute to the Muslim civilization. He said, after the Roman Empire, the Arab civilization, or the Muslim civilization, was the best civilizer of humanity, and the mild and the just and the peaceful government of the caliphs provided the world with that tranquility which is necessary for scholars to study the connecting principles of nature. I have paraphrased his quote, but he says something like this: a very lavish tribute he paid to the Muslim civilization. Was very much fascinated. And similarly, moving on to the 19th century, many scholars wrote amazing works on the Muslim civilization, even though much of the Muslim lands were colonized by now. In the 19th century, there was a lot of arrogance on the part of the British colonial administrators. They had studied the philosophy of John Stuart Mill, and all that utilitarian philosophy was put out, and this affected a lot of British administrators with much arrogance and pride in their own English identity. They started to look down upon natives of the lands they were governing, and this is where the relationship became a bit bitter. But still, despite all that, there were many English historians and authors writing amazing works on the Muslim civilization and paying lavish tributes. One of them, to mention one last name before we end this, because now it's 1 hour 20 minutes already gone, and then we can probably end it there and ask people to go and do their own research, inshallah, into these things we have mentioned today. One name, finally, I want to mention is a fascinating character called Professor Thomas Walker Arnold. Okay, Professor Thomas Arnold, the man who authored a very powerful work defending the civilization of Islam and how tolerant it was to the other. His book is titled Preaching of Islam. Preaching of Islam, first published in 1896 in London, and then the second edition in 1913. And I would strongly recommend the second edition, not the first, because the second edition was expanded by himself. And then also he published another work in 1931 titled The Legacy of Islam, where he pays another tribute to the Muslim civilization. Very much fascinating, absolutely amazing encyclopedia of information on Muslim civilization, how Islam expanded and how it affected the native people of the lands Muslim civilization occupied, or let's say, conquered. So, this was a lot of information to cover, Paul.
That's excellent. Thank you for that very much indeed, Adnan. I said before, do visit Adnan Rashid's YouTube channel. Just Google Adnan Rashid on YouTube, and follow him also on Mr. Adnan Rashid, Mr. Adnan Rashid on Twitter. But I'm glad we've got you recommending these particular books on camera, on record, so to speak, so we can go away and buy them, folks. Buy them and do your own research. So, in conclusion, Adnan, do you have any final words for us before we conclude?
The final words are, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, please continue reading, look into the books we recommended, and expand your own horizons. Go and start looking into these works, and don't stop. I mean, life is an ongoing process. We learn every single day. We learn something new. So learning must continue. So long as we live, as long as we are alive, we must learn, continue to learn, and help each other learn, so that we can make this world a better place. This is exactly why myself and Paul are at it. We want this world to be a better place, a more educated place. And in the process, we are learning ourselves. So we help each other. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for this opportunity, a great opportunity again. I hope I haven't exhausted everyone with so much information and so many names and dates. I do apologize.
No. I know from experience, your talks tend to revivify and keep everyone fresh. They don't wear them down. So that's great. All right. Well, thank you again very much, Adnan Rashid. And well, thank you. And until next time, and the history of Islam and Britain. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.